Good day to everybody. This is going to be the first in what we hope to be a long line of treatises on freedom, liberties, civil rights here in America. And it is imperative that we begin to get an understanding across this country of what rights and freedoms and liberties are. So what we're going to begin with today is we're going to begin with an essay that was created for this purposes. And the title of this essay, and you'll be able to find this online at some point, is called Sustaining Freedom and Liberty Under a Perceived Neo-Fascist Government. And while the title of this essay may be alarming in its proclamation that the U.S. government could be conceived as a neo-fascist system, under the categorization of the various forms of government and how they come into being, or came into being, the principles of neo-fascism are the closest to the present government's policies in restricting certain aspects of freedom and liberty. Judge Learned Hand stated that liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can do much to help it. While it lies there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. The general concepts of freedom and liberty in America have been eroded by the selfish desires of the few who seemingly wish to instill certain values on the entire populace. It should be enough that people within a society have the common goal of pursuing a peaceful society. Sufficient enough that it should not have to instill its will upon the people or upon other societies who may not share the same values. A society which understands certain fundamental rights, which cannot be given, but instead must be willed from generation to generation in an unbroken and unmolested manner. The founding fathers and framers, with the eventual will of the people, tore America from the grasp of a tyrant who was bent on bleeding the resources of a colony and crushing its spirit under a yoke of servitude, arisen from centuries of violently enforced fealty, oppressive taxes, which, if not paid, resulted in imprisonment, loss of goods, and death. At the same time, the fathers understood that each human being within the newly created society, with the exception of those who were enslaved, had certain rights to be free. Free from oppression, free from fear to speak out, and freedom from the general fear of living as one saw fit. So, what went wrong in America since the signing of the Declaration of Independence, since the creation of the Constitution of the United States, and since the forging of the Bill of Rights? What has happened to the freedoms that were once enjoyed by the majority? Why did America lose its perception of liberty? Perhaps these general concepts have been swept under the rug of greed, selfishness, and the myopic derision that seeps into a society through the implementation of a fascist-like, self-interested government that has stolen freedom and liberty from the masses in the name of personal economic gain for the few, and under the false premise that their freedoms must be restricted in order to protect the masses. And perhaps more likely and less conspiratorial is that many people in America have taken for granted the very concept of freedom and liberty. And through complacency in education, a societal belief that to gain wealth on the backs of others with no regard to the consequences is their right. Or perhaps the majority of people in America have forgotten what liberty and freedom is, and as such have no way to gauge when they have lost those things that were so dear to the founding fathers and subsequently dear to the populace of America. Freedom in its own right is not the ability to do whatever one wants at the expense of others. At the same time, it is not the belief in the right to travel where one wants, work where one wants, live where one wants, nor to be with whomever one wishes. These concepts are the same in other countries which harbor fascist governments, communist countries, and socialist countries. Many of these concepts are accepted practices in countries which harbor terrorism, dictatorships, benevolent and malevolent monarchies alike. Liberty, in its own right, is not freedom. And yet the concepts go hand in glove, because without one, the other is impossible to sustain, regardless of what type of government or nation in which one lives. Liberty is fundamentally intrinsic to the construct of any free society which desires to ensure that its peoples can acknowledge the freedom with which they have been willed through the blood of others, the blood that was spilled with the knowledge that others shall be. Today's America proclaimed that the seeds of liberty and freedom must be sown on all the populaces of the world, regardless of their respective government's desire, regardless of that nation's respective people's desire, and regardless of the way in which the world will view America's action. Selfishly, American politicians proclaim that every nation, which internally desires to have a notion of being free, should be assisted with the blood of America's people, people who have been told that dying on foreign soil somehow constitutes ensuring freedom on American soil. The mantra, "we must fight them over there so that we do not have to fight them over here," rings as a hollow testament to nationalism and ethnocentric bias, which in essence declares America to have some God-given right to exist as a nation at the expense of all other nations. No individual alive today has ever experienced an invasion from a foreign power. Setting aside the December 7th, 1941 attack on Pearl Harbor, located on the Hawaiian Islands, which had been annexed by the U.S., as a debilitating attack after which the United States found itself embroiled in a world war on three major fronts, a war in which America would develop and use the most devastating weapon the world had ever seen, annihilating close to 200,000 souls in two blinks of an eye. And setting aside the two attacks on the World Trade Center as a lashing out of a non-state actor whose frustration concerning America's foreign policy had reached a point that could not be reconciled by diplomatic means, nearly every individual alive today, in contrast, either knows someone personally or by association is aware of someone who has fought on a foreign battlefield, fought in the name of protecting a country from potential foreign invasion, fought in the name of defeating an ideal, which in theory works, but in practice, with the understanding that human nature will not permit such a system, communism and fascism alike has no other future but to implode upon itself. An ideal which created such a palpable fear that politicians within the United States were willing to put people on trial for their very belief in that system. While protecting its people from others' ideology, those who the people believe they have placed into power for the purpose of furthering the ideals of freedom and liberty within its own borders have created a certain failure. A failure which those who run the country by the supposed themselves by the confusions of their country or will flatter themselves with fairer prospects of elevation from the subdivision of the empire into several confederacies than from its union under one government. In essence, Hamilton makes the case that it is in fact the classes of citizens who are in power, who ultimately, for reasons of their own self-interested desires, which can only be attributed to the gaining of wealth and power, for there is no other justifiable reason to attempt to destroy a nation from within, make the choices to resort to political behavior in which the end result can only be the decimation of a way of life, one on the backs of others for the profit of a few. Most nations begin as an idea or a philosophy, but in time all nations, all attempts at autonomy, will lose that philosophy, that ideal, to the desire for power and economic gain. If one were to continue to believe that America was conceived under the ideals of religious freedom, the country is denigrated into a bastion of economic principle, namely capitalism. Capitalism originally was about the accumulation of wealth by individuals. Now, however, governments have cast their nets into the water of capitalism in order to strengthen the base of power. Words like religious freedom, freedom of the press and speech, and right to bear arms fall away as the nation relinquishes its original ideals and takes on the trappings of economic and military power. The general concepts of freedom often get broken down into discussions of freedom of speech, press, and religion, with the Constitution of the United States being the arbitrator of these discussions. But because no one person can rightly define what freedom is for the masses, each individual should have the ability to define freedom for oneself without the interference of others. The society in which American citizens live will not permit an individual to exercise the rights which one assigns to oneself, rather requiring the citizen to accept the definition which a few have passed down through the generations. The Supreme Court makes the ultimate determination of what constitutes specific aspects of freedom and liberty, but cannot and should never be the court of opinion on what constitutes freedom in general. One can consider the question of slavery when discussing the definition